Well, first of all, Mary, welcome back to the podcast, and thank you so much for doing this.
Yeah, nice to see you again, Ben.
Nice to see you. Yeah, you can't get rid of me these days. Sadly for you, but luckily for me. Um, you've been busy. You've been very busy. You've been
Yeah.
writing all sorts of wonderful papers, and
Mhm.
I think a good place to start is the common question: does your dietary intake of fat correlate with
Mhm.
heart disease?
It doesn't. It actually doesn't. And I wrote a paper with Dr. Fabian Dayrud. It was published in May 2024, so not that long ago. It was a lot of work. It was, and the other one we're going to talk about was a lot of work too. I was kind of at the same time researching both topics, but basically for about almost 2 years now, I've been working on this. I don't get paid to do this. It's just an obsession because of the wrong ideas about fat and saturated fat. And so around 1961, the American Heart Association um, had an idea called the lipid-heart hypothesis that eating more fat cause fat to build up in your arteries and cause heart attacks. There was they seemed to notice that there was an increase in heart attacks, mostly in middle-aged men. Well, for one thing, people were living a lot longer than they had, in the early part of the century. Around 1900, the average lifespan in the U.S. was 47 for somebody born in 1900. But by the 1950s, it had increased to 68, so a huge increase in lifespan. Well, the older you get, the more likely you're to die of heart disease. And one of the reasons that increased so much is that there were so many infections that were killing people. They were the leading causes of death, for, basically all of humankind, up until the around 1910 or so. But they had started hand washing in hospitals. I mean, there were surgical procedures and chlorinating water, vaccinations. Antibiotics came along in 1940, which I mean, basically treated and prevented deaths for millions of people from pneumonia and other horrible things. There were all kinds of diarrheal illnesses related to organisms that were in the water, organisms in milk. They started pasteurizing milk. So all these changes happened kind of towards the end of the 1800s. And so going into the 1900s, then vaccinations for smallpox came along that killed like 20% of people that got it. So these infectious diseases dropped way down, and heart disease had always been like number four, and it popped up to number one because people weren't getting infections. And now they're living longer, and the older you get, the more likely you are to die of heart disease. And you think we're all going to die. So I think of it this way: we're all going to die, and what would be, if you don't die from heart disease, you're going to die from something else. Well, the next leading cause of death is cancer. Do you want to die from cancer? Do you want to die from chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, COPD? Your other options aren't too wonderful. I mean, so if you like, for example, my grandmother, one of my grandmothers lived to be 93, and she had her mind intact, everything else, but eventually your cells can only divide so many times. Your heart's been pumping for 93 years, and it eventually fails. And basically, that's why she died. When you die of old age, I think maybe the best scenario is that you didn't die of cancer or some other ugly thing, that your heart just finally says, I'm done beating, boom, and you're done. So but that's that was looked at as, oh my gosh, heart disease is increasing. It's still the number one killer despite all their work worldwide, in the US and worldwide. Heart disease is the number one cause of death. Well, to me, that means in most cases, I mean, some people do, they have a heart attack, they die prematurely, but you get to your 80s or 90s and you die of heart disease, it means you didn't die of something else that might have been worse.
Mm.
So, but anyway, there was this obsession, with coronary artery disease causing heart attacks, mostly in middle-aged men. And most of the studies were done just on men. And women have heart attacks too, but they kind of ignored the women and just kind of studied men. And you know, um, none of the studies showed that reducing fat had any effect on heart disease. But yet in 1961, they started telling us to reduce our fat intake, that fat was the problem, that we should eat a low fat diet. We should start eating low fat or non fat dairy, for example. They were obsessed with eggs, that they had have a lot of cholesterol in them, that we should not eat eggs or greatly reduce our intake of eggs, and just, fat in general and animal fats. They kind of focused on animal fats. Lard, a lot of people cook with lard and butter. The problem with that is that lard and butter were already declining in throughout the 1920s, 30s, 40s, as these new industrial fats, hydrogenated fats, were becoming popular in the market. And we're talking about margarines and shortenings. So these, like the first shortening came along around 1911, came out from Procter and Gamble. We know it as Crisco here in the U.S. And it really started gaining market shares because it was cheaper. It was cheaper than lard. It was used as a replacement for lard, and margarine was used as a replacement for butter. But the problem with all these is that they were loaded with these trans fats that, are now actually banned from the U.S. food supply, virtually banned, because they're known to cause heart disease. But while they're doing all of these studies to look at the effects of fat in the diet, they didn't differentiate between natural sources of animal fat and these hydrogenated oils with trans fats. They call them all saturated fat. They said any fat that's solid at room temperature is saturated fat. They couldn't really, the analytical methods to determine this weren't really all that great. And the crazy thing, like lard actually has more monounsaturated fat than saturated fat in it. But it's, it's like rejected. Oh, lard's bad for you. Butter's bad for you. You have to eat margarines and shortenings. This was really a food industry ploy, marketing ploy, and it worked. And by 1940, people were eating more shortenings and margarines than they were lard and butter. In the 1940s already. So this heart disease issue became prominent in the mid 1950s. So we're talking like, 15 years later, when more and more people are eating these trans fats, that they're seeing an increase in heart attacks. So it wasn't natural saturated fat that was causing heart attacks. They were on the decline. And then coconut oil was especially, it's very high in saturated fat. You have to avoid coconut oil. Coconut oil was less than 1% of edible oil consumption in the US. Throughout the whole 20th century, it's still really low. It's maybe 2% at this point. And coconut oil clearly did not have anything to do with increasing rates of heart disease in the US.
Wow.
So, so then one of the studies, that kind of brought into focus that the low fat diet, reducing your fat intake doesn't really change outcomes, is what's called the National Diet Heart Study. And this was conducted around 1963 to 65. And it was a feasibility study at first. It was going to be 100,000 men that they were going to study. And the first study had about, I think, 2,200 men in it. And they had groups that had different levels, percentages of fat in their diet, but like everything else being the same. And they had two groups, like one had 40% fat, one had 30% fat. And they provided their foods. Anything that had fat in it was provided to them. And what they found, they were looking at total serum cholesterol levels. And what they found, that there was no difference between these two groups who ate high fat and low fat for their cholesterol levels at any time point over 2 years that they studied them. Actually it was about like 18 months to 2 years. No difference in cholesterol levels even, much less, and no difference in heart disease, events. They didn't find anything like that.
So where does the misconception come from that, if you go out, I know in the UK, if you go out and say, I'm eating all this saturated fat, the
Yeah.
next follow-up will be your cholesterol is going to get so high and you're going to have a heart attack. Where does that misconception come from?
Well, it comes from, so in these studies, when they did like a high saturated fat versus adding polyunsaturated oils, so we're talking like soybean oil, safflower, sunflower oil, some of these other oils, they found that when you substituted these polyunsaturated oils for saturated fat, that it appeared to lower your cholesterol level. And so they claimed that lowering your cholesterol level would lower your chances of dying. They say it increases cardiac risk, meaning that you're more likely to have a heart attack or you're more likely to die from a heart attack. Well, numerous studies, that we reported in our last paper showed that, yeah, you substitute polyunsaturated fat for saturated fat, and it does seem to lower, serum cholesterol. But none of these studies ever showed that it decreased your rate of dying from heart disease, or that it even very few studies even hinted that it decreased your events, adverse cardiac events like heart attacks,
Mm.
that people might have, so and then the other thing too was that a lot of these were short-term studies, so you make a drastic change in your diet, you're bound to have some metabolic changes, related to that. But as time goes on, like in this National Diet Heart Study, you know, toward, they actually, the lowest levels of cholesterol when they did this, when they substituted the polyunsaturated fat for saturated fat, was around like 6 to 12 weeks into the study. But by the time they got out to 18 months, they were almost back to where they had started out. So over time, the cholesterol level kind of comes back up. And, I just kind of think it's very possible we have kind of a metabolic set point. you know, this is what your body needs. Cholesterol is, people think cholesterol is bad. They have been given the impression cholesterol is bad. We could not live without cholesterol. So natural cholesterol, it's the support structure of every single cell in our body. It's in the cell membranes. It helps support the cell membranes. It's in the little organelles within the cell, those membranes. And in the brain, it is the brain's about 60 or 70% lipids, and a whole lot of that is cholesterol. And it's a support structure for all of these networks of neurons and other really delicate structures that we have in the brain. Cholesterol supports that. Um, when neurons connect with each other, there's a junction called the synapse, and it kind of fires. It's like an electrical signal that fires through the synapse. Cholesterol is required for that to happen. So, there are so many reasons, why cholesterol is important and
Mm.
vital. And so, why, for example, statins are pushed really hard in the US, but some of them are what we call lipid soluble. They could potentially remove cholesterol from your brain. Is that what you really want to do?
Wow.
And, there are studies showing that, and that's in the new article too, that people who are admitted with heart attacks to the hospital, many of them, well, more than half of them have a low LDL cholesterol level when they have a heart attack, and some even very low, like under, well, you probably use millimoles there. Oh, I don't know the conversions right off, but in the US, like under 130 milligrams per deciliter is considered normal. If you're at cardiac risk, they try to get you under 100 or
This
maybe
is
even under
LDL.
70 milligrams per deciliter.
LDL, we're talking, or
LDL,
right? Okay.
right?
So
Hmm.
that's it. It seems like we're popping like this general bubble, right? So
Hmm.
cholesterol levels aren't correlated with heart disease,
In
or
theory,
in theory, yes. What
yeah.
what are the markers that do actually drive heart disease then? What is it?
Yeah. Well, it seems to be more related to family history, genetics. Some people are more likely to get a heart attack, based on their family history. Hypertension, high blood pressure that's not well controlled is probably the number one cause of a heart attack or a stroke. So that's really prominent. Um, One of the big studies that's been going on since the 1940s is the Framingham study, and they had never fingered LDL cholesterol as the problem. But they did find that people who did not have heart attacks were more likely to have higher HDL levels, which is called the good cholesterol. Sometimes it basically LDL. There's misconceptions about LDL too, that it's just a cholesterol particle, but LDL is low density lipoprotein. So it's actually a combination of lipid and protein that's in a little globule, I guess you might say. And cholesterol is part of that. And these globules are formed, to carry fats, including DHA, which is important to the brain, vitamin D, the fat soluble vitamins A, E, D, K. They carry these and other fats to your cells to provide these important vital substances to your cells. LDL is part of that. It's a component of the shell that protects the stuff that's on the inside of it. So you reduce LDL in these shells, and it's not as protective of these substances, these important vitamins and DHA that are inside of this shell.
Right. And what effect would statins have on that shell?
It actually tends to reduce the cholesterol in it. It can make it a smaller, more dense particle.
So,
So yeah, so
okay.
basically, there has been quite a bit of study of different sizes of LDL. LDL comes in all different sizes. These particles. So large, fluffy LDL cells, they call them, are they don't seem to get into the arterial wall, very easily. Small, dense particles do. So when you take a statin, it doesn't decrease your percentage of small, dense particles. It might actually increase it. And these are now thought to be the culprits that can get into arterial walls. And the other thing, too, about LDL is that inflammation tends to oxidize LDL cholesterol, and oxidized cholesterol seems to be possibly a culprit. So inflammation and high blood sugar, chronically high blood sugar. So another thing, that diabetes is a very high risk factor for getting for developing heart disease, having a heart attack.
Hmm.
There's high blood sugar. It increases inflammation, and it increases small dense particles, but also oxidized cholesterol, which seem to
Okay.
be more harmful.
So okay, as you said, so for uh, cardiac events, oxidized cholesterol is what people need to be worried about, and oxidized cholesterol are downstream of metabolic dysfunction,
Yeah, it
diabetes,
is. It is
inflammation.
related to inflammation and high blood glucose, chronically high blood glucose, that type of thing. And
Right.
there can be nicks in the arteries. There can be infections along, when you get like a viral infection, it can invade the arteries. Bacteria can invade and
Right.
cause inflammation. And, these plaques that happen, we talk about plaques in arteries. And some of them are very densely, they have calcium in them. So there's a lot of different things in these plaques. Calcium's one of them, but calcium's not identified as like a big culprit. That we don't talk about, calcium. Where does this calcium come from?
Mm.
Why, do these plaques form around calcium? It's blamed on cholesterol, and cholesterol is actually it's part of a healing process.
Well,
So this is kind of how I think of these plaques. Okay. So you skin your knee. Okay, you're a kid, you fall down, you scrape the heck out of your knee. Well, adults do this too. They fall off their bike, they whatever. And you form a scab. It bleeds and then you form a scab. And I studied this a bit. The same components in the scab on your knee, they're the same type of components, the different types of cells and substances that come in when you have inflammation in an artery that forms a plaque, or a nick in an artery that forms a plaque. It's the same substances. It's almost like a scab that forms to try to protect the arterial wall. And these
mm,
arteries, when they're damaged repeatedly or there's inflammation, they can weaken. The wall can weaken if they're not repaired. So these are kind of like, I think of them as scabs that ultimately turn into like scars, that help protect. And if you have weakness in an artery, it can form a bleb. An aortic aneurysm can happen. Your artery, aorta can open up and you bleed out suddenly. I mean, terrible things. And
right.
strokes, these arteries in the brain, same thing. They weaken and they start bleeding. And so cholesterol is part of this repair process. It's one of many substances that are in these plaques.
Wow. It's amazing how far we are away from that being
Hmm.
mainstream. Cholesterol is
Hmm.
completely vilified. And as you
Yeah,
wonderfully put it better than
yeah,
I could, all these factors that cholesterol play a part of. I mean,
yeah.
I know if you want to castrate a man and his hormone,
Hmm.
you put him on a low fat diet with low cholesterol, and his testosterone will plummet to unsavory levels.
Yeah, yeah.
So yeah,
And
that gets wrapped up in this misconception as well. So
mhm,
okay, the cholesterol piece seems pretty clear. It seems like
yeah.
we misunderstand it. It's
Mhm.
not doesn't seem to
It's
be
not clear cut. It was an idea developed in the 1953s. It's still called the lipid-heart hypothesis because it has never been proven. But yet, our dietary guidelines for Americans, this low-fat diet, is based on this hypothesis from 1953 that has never been proven. They just cling to it. They're obsessed with it. And even for children, 2 years and older,
well.
low fat, fat free milk, they can't in school programs and, subsidized programs, food programs for, underfunded people, in the
Mhm,
US, even for their children at age 2 and above, they can't get whole milk, which is terrible.
mhm.
They're rapidly growing, their brains are rapidly growing, lipid rich bodies and brains, that need fat. Breast milk has 50% fat, more than half of it's saturated fat. you know
Evolutionary, it leaves clues, doesn't it? Right?
yeah, yeah, and it doesn't make sense, that we're all doing this. People have only gotten fatter, and more and more and more diabetes, since they instituted these
Mm.
ideas.
Well, heart disease, cancers, they're all on the rise, right?
Yeah, all
Um,
of it.
okay, so
Mhm,
if someone is listening to this and they
mhm,
thought that's brilliant, I understand. I think I'm with you. I'm staying with it.
mhm.
Okay, what is your updated model at looking of how you deal with fats on a day to day, and how does it inform your lens of how you go through life, looking
Yeah,
at
yeah,
fats and different fats?
yeah,
And maybe this is a good time to sort of weave in your new paper as well.
yeah, right, right. Yeah, so when I went to medical school, I was taught that coconut oil is an artery clogging fat, and saturated fat is bad. You want to stay away from, reduce your animal fat intake. All of this, based on studies that actually in the studies they provided animal saturated fats and trans fats together. They were studied together as saturated fats. But so then along comes my husband has develops Alzheimer's. I have been on a diet since I was 8 years old. Always struggling, with my weight, up and down like a yo-yo. I mean, sometimes up and down 70 pounds and then gaining it back over 2 or 3 years, trying to eat a low-fat diet and eating skim milk and eating cereals because they're low in fat and all that kind of thing. And, really buying into this, food pyramid that says we should eat 6 to 11 servings of grains a day and fat. We should minimize it. It was really something. And so my husband, we talked about it in the other podcast, so people I think can look at that for the whole story. But, he had early onset Alzheimer's. And I had kind of found in 2006 that diet might have something to do with Alzheimer's. There was a study showing people eating the most Mediterranean like diet with Alzheimer's lived on average 4 years longer than people with the least Mediterranean like diet. So we switched over to a Mediterranean diet, but he did continue to get worse. And then in 2008, I came upon a press release about a medical food that turned out to be MCT oil, medium chain triglyceride oil, that's extracted from coconut oil. And the people who had taken this MCT oil in the study, nearly half the people with Alzheimer's who took it had improvement in their cognitive testing scores. And I didn't think I could get MCT oil, so I got coconut oil and I figured out how much to give him to equal the medical food because coconut oil, it's like 60% medium chain triglycerides. It's very high in these medium chain triglycerides. So it's about 70% of the saturated fat in coconut oil are these medium chain triglycerides. They're not the same as the saturated fats that are prominent in like animal fats. Um, so I'm in a quandary here because he really improved very rapidly. He improved um, very significantly, and it was maintained for almost 4 years, before he had a big downturn again. But So I'm, as a physician, taught coconut oil clogs your arteries. you know, I was like, ugh, I hope I'm doing the right thing, by giving him all this coconut oil. I started giving him a lot of coconut oil. They were using one dose in the morning in this clinical trial with MCT oil, but the ketones to produce ketones basically. And in Alzheimer's, there's a problem with getting glucose into areas of the brain, and ketones are an alternative fuel that do get into these areas of the brain. So it's a brilliant idea to provide energy. Um, so I thought, well, in the studies that they did with MCT oil, the ketones were gone by 3 hours. So what does your brain do the other 21 hours? So I just started giving him coconut oil, breakfast, lunch, dinner, and little snacks throughout the day just to try to keep a steady stream of ketones going. And then after 6 or 8 weeks, I added MCT oil to it. I started making a mixture of coconut and MCT oil, and he continued to improve. I mean, really very dramatically. Um, but so when we instituted the Mediterranean diet, the big emphasis is on olive oil and butter. It's not on lard and margarine. I mean, on shortenings and margarines and these vegetable oils. When in the U.S. when we get a big container of vegetable oil, it's usually soybean oil,
Mm.
and I got rid of all those. And started. We just started cooking with olive oil and butter and relaxing our ideas about fat. Maybe a low fat diet isn't so bad. I started getting goat milk, which is really rich in medium chain triglycerides too.
Oh,
Yeah, and the cheeses are, and drinking whole milk. When we have milk. So really relaxing that, and I benefited dramatically from this. We started eating whole grains, more vegetables, cooked salmon, getting DHA, all that kind of thing. And I had really, over about 3 years, I lost 94 pounds,
look, that's a lot.
which for those who know kilos, that would be probably maybe 48, 50 kilos, something like that. It was a lot. I lost a lot of weight. I was going to the gym too, working out, I hadn't been able to keep all of it off, but most 2/3 of it I've been able to keep off over time. You know, um, but so when the coconut oil came along, it's like okay, I found it pretty easy to add to the diet, but I was always like this nagging thing. We were told coconut oil is so bad. What is it? Why is it in health food stores? That's where I got it from, health food stores. I thought, okay, this is kind of crazy. So I started reading up on it and just found out so many interesting things about it. Half of it is lauric acid. Lauric acid is highly antimicrobial. It kills viruses, fungus, bacteria, and a lot of which have been implicated in causing Alzheimer's disease. A lot of studies are now, there's been thousands of studies of different infections, several hundred of herpes simplex virus, which is fever blisters that people get on their mouth. They live in the nerves that start in the brain, and lauric acid kills these. It literally dissolves the lipid capsule around certain bacteria and candida and viruses, and can help control infections potentially. So there were just so many interesting things about coconut oil, loaded with polyphenols, and so is olive oil. Extra virgin olive oil has polyphenols. That's one of the big points about it. And polyphenols tend to be antioxidants, anti-inflammatory substances. So the more I learned about coconut oil, the more convinced I was that okay, maybe they're wrong about this artery clogging thing, you know. And what we saw, like my husband's cholesterol level, his HDL went up like doubled. It almost doubled, and that's the good cholesterol. That's what we were hoping for, and eventually, over time, his total cholesterol even came down below 200 milligrams per deciliter, which I think is maybe around 5 millimoles of cholesterol. I mean, somewhere around there. And his LDL cholesterol even eventually came down. It was kind of a gradual process.
Wow.
Um, but
And at the time, you didn't know what you knew now about cholesterol and the
Oh, I
late
didn't know any of this. Yeah, I mean, we had learned a little bit about how cholesterol functioned. I mean, we're talking biochemistry 101 in medical school,
Mm,
um, 3 hours of nutrition and 4 years of medical school. I was at
yeah, I don't
Monday
think it's much better
afternoon,
these
6
days.
hours Monday afternoon, not even credit hours. And, so, um, then, I was learning that, well, it increases HDL cholesterol. I mean, this is kind of well known for many years that it tends to do that. Um, but it was supposedly increase LDL cholesterol, based on certain studies. And is this a problem or not? I mean, a couple studies were showing that it increases the large, fluffy LDL that doesn't invade the arterial wall, so easily. Um, so, just trying to understand, you know, is this really true
Mm,
that coconut oil increases your cholesterol? And, when most of the people who I communicate with and that I've been writing for are older people who are worried about cognitive decline, and effects of aging and all this, but especially cognitive decline. They're really worried about getting Alzheimer's or they have it. They already have it. They have mild cognitive impairment. They want to fight it actively and have found, this information about, my husband and his response. And I think the last time we talked about a collection that I had presented at the Alzheimer's International um, Associ- uh, Alzheimer's Association International Conference in Amsterdam in 2023. It was a collection of 288 people who had reported responses to coconut and MCT oil, and it was a really high. It was like 90% had reported some kind of improvement, when taking this. But then they, reported cognitive improvements, behavioral, mood, less depression, anxiety, just all kinds of things like that, that came to light from it, and so this is out there now. So people, but, the biggest question I get is, but doesn't coconut oil increase your cholesterol? Do I need to worry about getting a heart attack?
mm,
And it's like, it was hard to tell somebody, no, absolutely, you won't get a heart. I mean, I couldn't really say that. And I
mm,
still really can't say that. I mean, there are many different factors in why somebody has a heart attack. But it doesn't seem to be coconut oil that
mm,
causes this problem. And, the way I look at it too, somebody with Alzheimer's, their brain is literally dying. If you add a food like coconut oil to your diet, how long would it take? It doesn't like put particles that clog your arteries. That is just absolutely not true that fats do that. And it could take years, So for you to have a heart attack, if it was going to cause a heart attack, So I kind of explained it a little bit that way. But I tell them, if you're worried about this, get your doctor's permission and have your doctor monitor your cholesterol levels.
mm,
If there's a worry, then, do what you need to do. Or another alternative is to take MCT oil, which is it's those medium chains extracted from the coconut oil. It's clear, it's liquid down to below freezing level. And it's the heavier fats have been taken out of it, so that might be an alternative if somebody is really worried about just taking coconut oil.
mm.
Um,
I think because the common question people ask around keto, and it comes up on the comments, and anything high fat related, is
Mhm.
to say,
Yeah.
okay, cool, I get all the metabolic health benefits, I
Mhm.
understand all of that, but I can't eat high fat because I
Mhm.
have genetically high cholesterol.
Right, right. And
So,
that's, yeah, it has the high fat really doesn't, it's well, there's a group of people, they call them the lean mass hyper responders, that when they go on a strict ketogenic diet, their LDL seems to go way up. And this is something that's being studied currently, but it doesn't seem to cause heart attacks or cause, any adverse effects like that, but hopefully these studies will get out really soon, the results will get out. But but most people, it doesn't, affect them that way. I mean, we're talking when this happens, it's somebody who's eating 75 or 80% fat of their calories as fat. That is really, really high. But if you're going to reduce your carbohydrate intake, like me, I try to stay under 40 or 50 grams a day. I'm usually average maybe 25 or 30 grams a day, you know.
How
So
much
that
fat do you have as well?
so my fat level would be maybe 60% fat.
Okay.
Okay. Um, somebody who eats that way, it's unlikely you're going to make your LDL go way, way, way up like that.
Mm.
These are, kind of unique individuals. It seems like that happens to. Um,
But
and then, but under 40 or 50 grams, you can even have, like 50 or 60% fat. Um, but I think too, it's the types of fat you eat. You don't
yes,
have to eat one type of fat. I tell people, eat a variety of fats. I mean, when my husband was getting coconut and MCT oil, we were also eating olive oil and butter, and whole full fat milk, dairy, and and sometimes maybe a little sunflower oil or something like that. Foods like when we go out to eat, we're probably getting more of these polyunsaturated fats.
mm,
But I mean, the polyunsaturated fats, all these natural oils and fats have saturated fat, monounsaturated fat, polyunsaturated fat. They're just in different ratios. So if
mm,
you eat olive oil, you're getting, polyunsaturated fat in olive oil. You're getting it in butter. You're getting it in animal fat. You get polyunsaturated fats. If you eat fish, you get omega 3s and omega 6s.
yeah,
And really
it's
any animal fat, you usually get some omega 3 and omega 6s. Mammals need omega 3s. So if you eat beef or pork, you're going to get some from that, and you'll get enough omega 6, from eating that.
mm. Okay, so that clears up the whole misconception around fats, right? And
Mm-hmm.
the cholesterol piece that seems
Yeah,
pretty clear.
yeah,
When it comes to we're sort of now we're at the cliff for your wonderful research.
yeah.
So when it comes to people, or I guess how you came to that conclusion
Mhm,
that coconut oil does not cause or is not correlated with cardiac
mhm,
event.
mhm,
How did you come that? How did the study come about? And
mhm.
tell us what you learned through the study.
Okay. So yeah, I basically was trying to answer the question, does coconut oil increase your cholesterol? Basically, and specifically LDL cholesterol. That's what is the big worry now. And so there have been quite a few studies of coconut oil, and usually comparing coconut oil to another oil or fat. In some studies, it would be up to two or three other oils and fats. And coconut oil was often used to represent saturated fat. Um, and So there have been some meta-analyses, they call it, where they try to analyze a number of different studies to try to look at the relative effects of coconut oil versus another oil. And so there was a study that came out like that. It was a systematic review and meta-analysis in 2020. It was published in Circulation, American Heart Association's journal. And basically they looked at 16 studies, coconut oil studies, and they came to the conclusion that coconut oil increases LDL cholesterol and therefore it should be avoided. They also decided that coconut oil had no health benefits whatsoever, that there were no redeeming features, that it had no health benefits. And I kind of became a little bit obsessed with that article because, you know, um, when you look at, I started looking at the studies that they included, the actual results of the actual studies, reading from cover to cover the reports on these 16 studies. There were actually 17 of them. One of the studies wasn't even coconut oil, it was MCT oil that they had studied. They called it coconut oil, and they called it fractionated coconut oil, which meant it was MCT oil, and they specifically said it wasn't coconut oil in the study, but they included this one anyway, which wasn't really legit. There were two studies that were from 1991 and 1992 by the same group, and they had used a weird coconut oil. Coconut oil has a really consistent fatty acid composition. It's, and this one had it was about 15 to 20% lower in saturated fat than coconut oil usually is.
Oh,
And it
right.
was higher in polyunsaturated fat and monounsaturated fat than coconut oil usually is. Well, there's a practice in the oil industry, in the dark corners of the oil industry, that sometimes they will dilute an oil with another oil, a cheaper oil.
Hmm.
And it's, very suspect that that is what happened in these two studies. And it could even have been like a trans fat oil, that they studied. We don't know because they
Hmm.
didn't really say. They didn't, but they published the fatty acid composition. It was just really off for coconut oil. So those two studies had been included in their 17 studies, and then the way they reported the data was kind of weird. They had like a graph that showed whether, like, for each study compared to the other oil, um, did coconut oil increase or decrease LDL or not change it, basically. And, just one example, there was a study that it was of women, and it was a weight loss study. Just losing weight can decrease your cholesterol levels. It's just, people need to know that, and they were in four different groups, and they were basically on the same kind of a diet, but they were taking a supplement of either like coconut, chia oil, extra virgin olive oil, or soybean oil. And they studied these four groups. And the women taking coconut oil, they lost a lot of weight, and their LDL cholesterol went down by minus 14 milligrams per deciliter. But what they did for this analysis was they looked at the other three oils, and chia oil. The women that were taking some chia oil, their cholesterol level went down by 9 points more than the coconut oil did. So both of these oils, they had a decrease in cholesterol. It's just that the women taking chia oil had a greater decrease than the women taking coconut oil. Well, what they reported that was that it was an increase in LDL cholesterol. They said coconut oil increased LDL cholesterol by 9 milligrams per deciliter, instead of reporting that it decreased it by 14 milligrams per deciliter. So
Right.
yeah, so they were reporting it relative to what happened with these other oils.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So, do you think there were some perverse incentives at play? I mean, why? How over 17 studies? How could they get it so wrong?
Well, I mean, their calculations as far as comparing it to the other oils, were, I mean, I looked at them. Yeah, yeah, okay. So chia oil, the women, but was it really the chia oil? They were relatively small groups too
Hmm.
of people. Was it just lucky maybe those women lost more weight? Maybe there was another reason why their cholesterol went down more. Um, but you know, each study was reported that way. And for example, there was a 2-year study of men who they had some kind of cardiac intervention. They'd had stents, they'd had bypass surgery, they were all on statins, and it was a large study. This was the largest study and the longest study of all of these. 2-year study, and there was 100 in each group, that they started out with, and by the end of the 2 years, there were still like 94 and 96 in the two groups. And one group was added; they got about 3 tablespoons of coconut oil a day, that they could use any way they wanted to in their cooking. They could put it in their food, whatever. And the other group got sunflower oil, and it was to take the same amount, basically
Hmm.
about 3 tablespoons a day, just to add it to their foods for 2 years. At the end of it, they were at no time point were they any different in their cholesterol levels, and they didn't measure them real early on, but at 3 months they did. And already at 3 months, I mean, there was no difference, statistical difference between the two groups and what their cholesterol levels were, which was pretty interesting. But their HDL levels did go up, actually, for both groups. It went up for the coconut oil group, and it went up for the sunflower oil group. And but in this review and analysis, it was reported that coconut oil decreased HDL cholesterol.
Oh,
And
right.
yeah.
Okay.
It was that it went up a little bit higher in the sunflower oil group than it did in the coconut oil group, HDL cholesterol, but it went up in both groups, but they reported as a decrease in HDL cholesterol.
Right. Wow. Okay. So they put out this meta-analysis of 17 studies, and you're going through it, and there's
Mhm.
something just not quite right. A little bit
Right,
fishy, and things just aren't adding up.
right.
So you decide to take matters into your own hands
Yeah,
and
yeah,
and conduct your own analysis of 26
right.
studies on the
Yeah,
impact of coconut oil on lipid parameters, total
yes.
and LDL cholesterol.
Yeah, yeah. So at first I was kind of focusing on those 16, 17 studies, and then I found that they had missed a lot of studies.
Hmm.
There were studies that they could have included, but they didn't. Plus, a whole bunch of studies had gotten done. I mean, they probably started working on their paper, preparing it maybe in 2019, but between 2019 and 2024, there were a whole slew of other studies. So basically, there were 26 studies available that had been conducted between 1985 and 2024 that had groups of people who had consumed coconut oil as part of a clinical trial, and they had complete results for total LDL, HDL, cholesterol, and triglycerides. Basically, we looked for those studies, and there were 26 studies, that met that criteria that had groups of people, and taking it for at least 3 weeks too. That seems to be a minimal. Well, in these other, like in this review, that they felt that cholesterol levels likely stabilize at 3 weeks, which is ridiculous. But so they were looking at studies, 3 weeks and over, so we limited also to 3 weeks and over. I mean, a study of 1 week, a lot of them are liquid diet studies, very few people are eating a liquid diet. So it doesn't really have much application in the real world, so we didn't include studies like that. These were people eating real food, who were taking, had coconut oil added to their diet. So what we focused on was what happened to the people who were eating coconut oil, period, not compared to other oils and fats. What was the relative amount? What was the actual amount of people, in these studies? And these studies were from all over the world. A number of them were in the US, but, others in the UK and Europe, different countries in Europe, New Zealand, different various countries in Asia, that had conducted these studies. So wide variety of diets, throughout the world. And in some cases, the diets were completely provided, the foods were provided and had measurable amounts, that they could be certain, that this is what they were eating. But in most cases, the people, were to add it to their own diet, just and not necessarily, they weren't usually even told replace other fats with this fat, that type of thing. They were just told, use this in your diet. um, and a lot of times they had like a target percentage of fat, uh,
Mm,
or they would after the fact look at what their diet was and analyze what percent of fat they were eating,
okay,
that kind of thing.
sure. And
Yeah.
so what surprised you most doing the analysis of the 26 study?
Okay. What surprised me most, so we came up with 984 sets of data, from people that were consuming coconut oil that had, all of these, cholesterol levels and triglycerides. And when they were all averaged, each person was equally weighted in the study, just a simple average of these studies. It came out to virtually zero change in total cholesterol when we added them all together. It actually was a slight decrease. It was less than 1% decrease in total cholesterol and LDL cholesterol. And it was almost a 5% increase in HDL cholesterol
Wow.
and lower triglycerides, consistently lower triglycerides. And, that was really kind of my biggest surprise. I didn't know what would happen, when I added
Mm,
all of these up. And it came out to, well, to say what you can say on average, coconut oil does not increase your total or LDL cholesterol. On average, it does increase LDL cholesterol, and on average, it lowers triglycerides. You
wow.
know, um,
And off the back of that,
uh
so
huh.
what are the implications for I guess I'm always interested in how very smart people like yourself learn things in the research and collect their own research, but then the implications of the research inform
Yeah,
how they actually go forward. So,
yeah, how you
what
go forward.
exactly? So,
Yeah.
after this, how has it changed how you view your own intake of fats, if at all?
Yeah, well,
Specifically,
I wanna expand a little bit on the study because
please. Yeah.
okay, because one of the things that we noticed in these studies, they were what you call very heterogeneous. Different groups of people, different age groups of people. A lot of the studies wanted people who had no problem with their cholesterol, and other studies recruited people who did all have problems with high cholesterol, this kind of thing. So it was really heterogeneous. But one thing that struck me was that they do what they call standard deviations. That when they make this change, well, where did they start out? Their cholesterol levels were so widely disparate. Like in one study, the average would be 150. That they started at 150 milligrams per deciliter, and these are some basically some countries in Asia, where people are known to have lower cholesterol levels. And then and some other studies, the starting point was 250 milligrams per deciliter,
Mm,
LDL almost double, 90 milligrams per deciliter in some studies was the average, and in others, 180 milligrams per deciliter, people that were known to have. And they're putting these people together in the studies, and they have standard deviations. So what is the range that people will follow in? 95% of people will fall in around like the average that they come up with. And it would be like, 20, 30% in either direction. People could have a decrease in their cholesterol of 20 or 30% from the average, compared to the average. Some people had an increase of 20 or 30% compared to the average. So
mm.
what it basically said was that the response among individuals was really highly variable. It could be a small amount above or below. It could be a large amount above or below, the average and the baseline from where they started out. So, it just kind of indicates to me, kind of what I was saying before, if you're worried about your cholesterol, monitor it, and then work with your doctor to, decide whether this is something that's okay for you or not. But,
Mm.
but there's still a question is, does LDL have anything to do with increasing your risk?
Yeah,
That's
well,
the other thing, that is really hard to answer, but I think it's safe to say you can't just say on average the coconut oil increases your cholesterol. That's just not
mm.
true.
And
Um,
even if it did, would that be a bad thing?
it might not be a bad thing if it increases your proportion of large, fluffy LDL particles to small, dense particles. That could be an improvement.
Mm,
And there are these ratios, and this is another thing that we talk about in the study. There are ratios of the other um, cholesterols to HDL cholesterol. There's total to HDL cholesterol, LDL to HDL, and triglycerides to HDL cholesterol. And a lower number is better. And in all cases, regardless of the duration of study, it decreased these ratios, which is thought to help decrease your risk of heart disease.
well,
So, that was the other thing that we found.
well,
So,
it's quite paradigm shifting
mhm,
things you found, right?
mhm,
It's so
yeah,
non-consensus that
yeah,
it has the risk of being like shot down, which
mhm,
I hope it doesn't. I hope this does
mhm,
start more debate around everything we've been
yeah.
speaking about.
Yeah,
Um,
I hope it allays concerns, for a lot of people. Um,
yeah,
yeah, and even the other thing we found too, because we divided them because we looked at all of them combined, and then we looked at short, medium, and long duration studies. So, like the short studies were 7 weeks or under, and these standard deviations, like the big spread, of how high or how low their individuals went, it was half at medium term studies compared to the short term studies. It was much narrower, which kind of indicates that over time, that if you have a big increase or even a big decrease in your cholesterol levels, it may slowly return to normal, the long-term study, there was almost no difference, between where they started and where they ended up at 1 year or 2 years. There was, and even at 3 months, there was very little difference between where they started out and where they ended up.
Right.
So and but there are very few long-term studies like that.
Yeah, I mean, the nutrition research is hard, right? Because there's
It
so
is
many variables to,
so many variables,
yeah,
and
it's such a complex system.
yeah,
Um, okay, um, condensing all of that down
yeah.
into a takeaway for
Mhm,
the audience,
mhm,
what is, would you say the key takeaway is, if you're thinking about upping your fats, as a load
mhm,
of reasons why
mhm,
coconut oil is a pretty safe way to do that?
mhm. Yeah, I think it's a safe way. You could add, you know, like people ask me how much, if they're trying to fight, cognitive decline, how much should they take? I think if they're using it for prevention, they might aim for 2 or 3 tablespoons a day, something like that.
Is that
You
all?
know,
Wow.
if they're trying to improve, that might help. I mean, my husband was taking a little over 2 tablespoons and had a dramatic improvement just in the beginning, once a day taking that. And then, as we increased it, we were seeing more and more improvement. But, people who have a problem, see if they can tolerate it, push to maybe 4 to 6 tablespoons a day,
Wow.
something like that. But it doesn't mean you have to eliminate other fats. If you're eating a low fat diet, you can just gradually add it to your diet, add it slowly. If you eat add a whole bunch of fat all at once, you're going to probably get diarrhea. There's a good
Mm,
chance you don't want to do that. But, just add it to, and then you rethink the other fats that you're eating. If you're eating skim milk, there's really not a problem with increasing that to full fat milk. Some of that milk fat is medium chain triglycerides. Like we talked about, human breast milk is about, depending on the maturity of the baby, is somewhere between 10 and 17% medium chain triglycerides, and
mm.
most of that's lauric acid.
Wow.
It helps protect the baby from infection. That's those studies have been done like decades ago. Um, so, eating full fat milk will give you some more medium chain triglycerides. Eating cheeses, full fat cheeses, like in the US, we have all these fat free cheeses. What the heck are they? I don't even know what they are. They
I think
wouldn't be
it's
from
just
milk
fat
fat.
free.
They're
Fat,
artificial foods.
yeah, it's concerning.
And they
Okay,
also,
so um, if we do some quick fire questions,
yeah, okay.
which would be quite fun. So, um, if you have you speak a lot at wonderful events, and you do presentations, and if you wanted to put your brain into gear,
Mhm.
how much coconut oil would you try to have? And
Oh,
or what would you, how would you tailor your diet to make sure your brain is lit up for the talk?
yeah. Well, that it's actually happened. Like, I remember giving a talk in Japan, like a day after I had arrived. You're completely flip flopped. You're
Mm.
like 14 hours ahead there. So, I remember not sleeping, hardly at all the night before I gave a talk. But I took some MCT oil, and and I was fine. I was like fine the whole day.
Mm.
But I start my day with coconut MCT oil in coffee. That's how I start every morning. And I do an overnight fast. Basically, I don't eat for probably at least 14 hours. Where I don't have anything other than water. And then I start with that. That will increase your ketone levels further. You're already in a mild ketosis if you do the overnight fast. You add MCT and coconut, and then your ketone levels will start increasing further. And I tend to have some, probably averaging about a tablespoon, with each meal, sometimes more. And altogether, I probably get the equivalent of maybe 4 or 5 tablespoons a day of a combination of coconut and MCT oil. I like to cook in coconut, like virgin coconut oil.
Mm.
I make this mixture that helped my husband so much. I started taking it when he did. I was worried about getting Alzheimer's myself. It's very strong on one side of my family, and so I thought if it could help somebody with Alzheimer's, it might be able to prevent it. So I've been taking this ever since 2008 myself. So I have this mixture. I put it in things like yogurt or cottage cheese. I put it on salad. Yeah, I put a little other salad dressing on there too, and I
And
put it
that's
in
blended
olive
coconut
oil.
and MCT.
This is the coconut MCT. Yeah, So basically, when I have whole coconut oil, it's usually to cook something. Like I'll make an omelet in it, scrambled eggs. Um, I make these keto pancakes. They're really cool. They're made with coconut flour and almond flour, and then an egg, is mixed in there, and I cook them, and it's like half butter, half coconut oil.
Brilliant.
So I do things like that, and then like salads, I tend to put part olive oil and part this mixture of coconut and MCT oil, and so I do mix up my fats. When I have milk, it's whole fat milk. I have Greek yogurt that's full fat. That's one of my favorite snacks, and it doesn't have much carbs. It's got a ton of protein in it. I'll mix some of that MCT and coconut in that. It just blends in real easy. Just makes it a little creamier.
Mm,
Yeah. So there are a
good.
lot of different foods. You can put it in any kind of soup, anything warm. It'll melt on. You could mix your vegetables in it. Like some people put butter on their vegetables, and you can even put a combination of a little butter and a little bit of that.
Brilliant, brilliant. So
Yeah.
if you're worried about cognitive decline, you want to optimize your mental performance and give your
Mhm.
brain slightly more energy. You
Mhm.
don't need to be worried about coconut or MCT when it comes to heart disease.
Right. I think that's the bottom line. You can add
Wonderful.
it, you know, I just think eat a variety of fats. Don't eat trans fats.
Yeah.
I don't
What
know
would
if
be
they're banned
your?
yet in the UK, but
I'm
almost
not
all
sure.
margarines in the US. This was there was like a report from 1995 on trans fats, and they said that virtually all cooking and salad oils in the US between the 1960s and 1980s were partially hydrogenated with trans fats.
Oh gosh, yeah.
Yeah.
And
Yes.
trans fats for people listening, could you give like what sort of be top three examples of your day to day trans fat?
Oh, okay. So the main trans fat is called oleic acid. And what happens with when they hydrogenate it in oil, they're trying to make it more shelf stable. So they're actually trying to saturate the oil, make it
Mm,
more saturated. And that's why it turns solid, becomes like a margarine or a shortening. They start with a liquid oil, like say soybean oil, cottonseed oil was one that was used a lot to make Crisco. I think it still is. Um, and they subject it to very high heat, high pressure, and they inject hydrogen ions into it. And the hydrogen ions kind of fill up these spaces and molecules and saturate the molecule. That's what makes it saturated. You know, um, Polyunsaturated means there are spaces that could have a hydrogen ion, but they don't.
okay.
Um, so they become very saturated, and they can become heavily hydrogenated, meaning that they could be almost 100%. They can make it 100% saturated fat. They can do this to coconut oil. They can make it 100% saturated fat.
Really?
But
Well.
in the process of this high heat and high pressure, it changes the molecules. So, like the most prominent fatty acid in olive oil is called oleic acid. I think a lot of
Mm,
people are familiar with that. It's omega-9 fatty acid, but it's oleic acid. It's about 70% of olive oil. When and all of these other oils, soybean, they all have oleic acid in it. Okay. So when they superheat it, subjected to pressure, it warps the molecule. So there's like oleic acid is 18 carbons long. It's like a little bead, 18 carbons. It's got one, what they call a double bond. There's one spot that is missing basically a pair of hydrogen ions.
mm,
And it has a certain conformation. It kind of bends, the molecule bends. Okay. When they do this high heat, high pressure, it changes this double bond, it twists the molecule, it stiffens it, so it's basically got the same 18 carbons and one double bond, but it's been twisted and it's stiffer, it's rigid. And when you put natural oleic acid like into a cell membrane, it helps it make it more fluid because it bends. It's
hmm.
bendable, so it's more fluid. You put these stiff trans fats in, it makes the cell membrane less flexible, less fluid, and it decreases the lifespan of the cell. It also affects what gets in and out of the cell. So that's why these trans fats are so harmful.
Mm,
Potentially, and this
okay.
happens in brain cells and heart cells. It happens in all of our cells. That these trans fats can get in.
Okay,
And
so trans fats are out
yeah,
and
trans fats are
avoid
out.
them.
So
Okay.
be sure, like in the US, they require, I don't know what happens in the UK, but they're required to put trans fats on the label, how much trans fat is in a product. And they're allowed to have up to a half a gram per serving
Ooh,
of
right.
trans fat. But like McDonald's fries, for example, I have a friend, she was a lipid biochemist at University of Maryland, and she told me that like a medium order of McDonald's fries would have 35 grams of trans fats in them.
Oof,
Huge amount of fat. I mean, 35 grams, that's a little over 2 tablespoons of
wow.
fat that were pure trans fats.
Mm.
They weren't just
I
hydrogenated fat, they were the actual trans fats.
Yeah, but it's funny because you say trans fats, but the consensus would just hear fat, and then
Right.
they would rule out everything: butter, olive
Hmm.
oil, avocados, coconut oil, MCT.
Yeah, yeah,
Everything that is good. So I think yeah, it's an important message to get out
yeah,
there.
yeah. Like
Um,
the ingredients here, they have to say, is there hydrogenated fat? They have to put it in as an ingredient if it's hydrogenated fat or partially hydrogenated fat. That has to appear on the label, and then the amount of trans fat per, well, they also have saturated fat, um, per serving. And I
okay.
think some of them just kind of made their serving sizes smaller so that they would fit into that, but
Oh right, yeah.
yeah.
Perverse incentives, right?
Mhm.
It's funny how uh, one idea taken for commercial
Mhm.
gain can
Mhm.
affect the course of history with regards to fats and
Mhm.
how people end up
Yeah,
living their day-to-day lives, right?
yeah. So
Another
just don't
question.
look for those on the label.
Yeah, exactly, exactly.
Mhm.
Um, another question for you, Mary, which I actually really wanted to ask you is: do you think most diseases are metabolic in nature?
I think most what they call non-communicable diseases, so these are non-infectious diseases, are metabolic, but even some infections might be. I think you can create a milieu in your body of inflammation that promotes infections, or worsens, your reaction to infection. They can affect your immune system, metabolic diseases, such that you can't fight infections very well. So I do think that your metabolism, um, the status of your metabolism probably does underlie most disease, that occurs.
Mm,
Um, yeah,
well,
and
good.
that's why it's so important to really, really, really think about what you're eating and avoiding these artificial foods and ultra processed foods that are loaded with fructose and all kinds of chemicals that were never found in nature before that they have created to try to preserve, and hormones that they feed to animals and antibiotics and all these kind of things, just to try to avoid that as much as possible because
Mm,
they can have impacts on your metabolism.
yeah,
Mhm.
absolutely. I mean, I'm. It's funny. I think if someone said that to me this time last year, I don't think I would have been quite there, but
Yeah,
I firmly believe
yeah,
that now.
yeah.
Um, well, and also I want to just talk about your see the complete book of ketones behind you, and also clearly keto. I
Oh,
read clearly keto in the
yeah.
summer, and it is wonderful. I mean, if anyone's really
Yeah,
wants to go quite deep with regards
yeah.
to maintaining cognitive function,
Mhm.
Mary has done all the work for you, and I do highly recommend buying clearly keto.
Yeah.
Um, my last question for you, Mary, is what's next for you? You've just done this wonderful study. Where is your interest pulling you next?
It's still so Dr. He's Toby, but Fabian Dayrit, he goes by Toby. He's in the Philippines. He's a PhD chemist that trained at Princeton in the US and then did some work at Oxford. So he's just a great writing partner, and he has worked with government agencies in Manila. He's at Ateneo University in Manila in the Philippines, and worked with governments, intergovernmental agencies, and this kind of thing, in these coconut producing countries, I should say. And he so we both just kind of have this passion about the dietary guidelines for Americans, the horrible mythology that has evolved around coconut oil that is bad, and trying to undo that harm. Um, and so we plan one more paper, so we're going to have a trilogy,
Good.
basically.
Like the Matrix, but better,
And
right?
yeah, so this one is going to talk about the health benefits of coconut oil and the basis for all of that.
Hmm.
Each of the fatty acids in coconut oil has really important metabolic effects, and they're positive, basically positive effects. So much study is being done now just with lauric acid, which is half of the coconut oil that we mentioned. It's antimicrobial, but
Hmm.
so we're going to talk about health benefits and of all kinds.
Brilliant.
There's a great lady. What is her? I can't remember her last name, but I've heard her at several presentations in Manila. She's a dermatologist, and she's done extensive studies of coconut oil effects on various skin conditions.
Hmm.
I met a plastic surgeon there. She had developed a spray of lauric acid to use for wound healing, and we're talking some really horrible wounds. She showed me that uh, improved remarkably, using the spray of lauric acid to cover the wound and
That's
protect it.
interesting.
Incredible dental care. I can't remember if we ever talked about oil pulling, but this is kind of an ancient practice in India that Ayurvedic medicine for about 4,000 years. They have been using oil pulling, where you put oil in your mouth and you work it around your mouth, and it helps protect your teeth, prevent cavities and all this. If you use coconut oil with the lauric acid, it's known to kill dental microbes, which have also been implicated for Alzheimer's.
Hmm.
So I started just personal side note. Back when I first heard about oil pulling, which was probably around 2008 or 2009 when this happened with my husband. Somebody sent me a book on it, and I thought, well, this is intriguing, and so I started doing that, and I just found that my teeth were much cleaner and everything, and then I started also brushing my teeth with it, and I used to always have cavities, a new crown every couple of years, and not a single new cavity, a new crown. I go to the dentist, they say, oh, you floss really well. It's like, well, I'm doing oil pulling and brushing my teeth with coconut is the main thing that I'm doing, and now I use like a water pick to kind of push any food that's out in there. But so that's just a personal thing. But there are studies showing that it greatly reduces this oil pulling, greatly reduces gingivitis, which is inflammation and infection of the gums. It reduces plaque that forms on the teeth, which is formed by these bacteria, these organisms that, we have in our mouth. So, a simple thing like that could greatly reduce your dental expenses over time.
Absolutely, and maybe risk of Alzheimer's as well. Yeah, I
Yeah.
didn't know the lauric acid had. I mean, obviously, I've learned so much about from
Yeah.
you with regards to coconut oil and lauric
Yeah.
acid MCTs. And I think another point which people maybe not know is all of these anything that gets converted into ketones in your body. Yes,
Mhm.
they're a different fuel, but they're also signaling molecules for
Yes, they
downstream
are.
effects of
Yeah, they
some.
reduce inflammation. They reduce ketones reduce inflammation, and
Yeah,
substances in coconut oil reduce inflammation. Other substances too, these polyphenols, and yeah, it's really intriguing. There's just so
brilliant.
much that's yet to be learned, about these fats. The other medium chain triglycerides. Well, there's one called C8, which is real popular as an MCT oil. And then the others tend to be combinations of C8 and C10.
Mm.
Those cross the blood-brain barrier. They're known to be used directly as fuel by mitochondria. I mean, directly as fuel, in the brain. They've
Well,
been able to show this. And lauric acid just hasn't been studied yet. I strongly suspect that it does. It has been studied in cell cultures. So astrocytes, which are the cells that nourish the neurons in the brain, um, potently produce ketones in response to lauric acid. And this is in cell cultures. So lauric acid appears to stimulate ketone production in these astrocytes that nourish neurons. So now it just has to be proven that this actually happens in the brain.
mm.
Like they could do a mouse study. I've been trying to beg somebody, please do this study. I can't get
Well,
anybody to do it
well,
yet.
I really can't wait to read your next study. I think
Yeah,
it'll be fascinating, and I want to go and run out and buy coconut oil now. And although
yeah,
since our first podcast, I have been doing the oil pulling with the coconut oil.
Yeah.
and just having more coconut oil in general. And it does light your brain up in a way that's quite unique. I mean,
Hmm.
as MCTs do as well. But
Yeah.
if you're interested in that topic, go and check out our first podcast we did,
Yeah.
or Mary
Yeah.
did with us,
Yeah.
and some good content there. But look, Mary, thank you so much for coming
Oh,
on.
you're welcome. You're welcome.
Uh,
It's really great. I really appreciate you having me on again. I
Oh,
love talking about this stuff.
anytime.
I just talk nonstop and
No, look. If the episode was the inverse, it's not an exciting episode. If you talk more than I do, it's exciting. So that's what we got you on for. Clearly, keto. You can find it on Amazon in the UK. I'm pretty sure in the US as well. The complete book of ketones. Coconut keto is your
oh,
uh,
coconutketones.com.
coconut ketones is
Yeah,
Mary's
so
website.
it's COCONUTKETONES.com. And I
Wonderful.
have a
Well,
page on Alzheimer's and dementia. I also have another one for basically getting started with a ketogenic diet. That one page seems to be popular. Links to my books and yeah, all of that.
beautiful.
Scientific articles, a whole slew of articles, studies that have been done and related to ketones, coconut MCT oil, and mainly Alzheimer's and Parkinson's and other conditions. But
Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely. I do recommend checking it out.
mhm,
It's like a choose your own adventure for this whole world, and
yeah,
it's brilliant. You can go get lost in it in the best kind of way.
yeah.
Mary, appreciate you coming on. Appreciate you. Thanks so
Thank you
much,
so much,
and
Ben.
we'll
Bye to
speak soon.
everybody. Thank you for listening. If you got to the end, that's great.
Yeah, well done, everyone. No, it was great. Thank you so much.